The Kalam cosmological argument may be the argument in the history of philosophy that received the worst, the most ridiculous criticisms. The fact is that by now everybody and their favorite Pat has voiced an opinion on it, and most of the takes on it are just forgettable, to put it mildly. I will also admit that it may be the worst defended argument, since too many know-nothing apologists just trot out the syllogism thinking that it sounds good and will therefore convince people. And therefore I thought it would maybe be a decent idea to highlight some of the good responses to the Kalam. Of course, I can only give a few examples, but I believe these examples can lead by example. The first is the classic paper by Wes Morrison that appeared around the year 2000, I believe. It's titled, "Must the Beginning of the Universe Have a Personal Cause? A Critical Examination of the Kalam Cosmological Argument." The paper consists of two distinct parts. The first part critiques the idea that the universe's supposed temporal finitude implies that it needs a cause, and in the second part Morrison grants the fact that the universe may need a cause for the sake of argument, but presents a critique of William Lane Craig's reasoning implying that such a cause must be personal. I must say, Morrison's writing style is a thing of beauty. The man simply knows how to write a paper, wholly apart from the specific argument. He points out ambiguities, criticizes but then immediately steelmans and elaborates on his critique, all the while carrying the reader along from point to point. It's a very nice read indeed. I mean, compare this to a paper written by James Ross. Morrison begins by listing the advantages of the Kalam over Leibnizian style arguments. It doesn't rely on a full-blown version of the PSR, and therefore it doesn't rely on a notion of a being whose existence is somehow self-explanatory. Morrison then turns to the question of whether or not the intuition that from nothing nothing comes justifies the first premise of the argument that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Morrison tacitly accepts Craig's definition of begins to exist as X begins to exist if and only if X exists at T and there is no time immediately prior to T at which X exists. Then he analyzes the concept of something coming from nothing. Morrison points out that the phrase, "if nothing existed," should not be understood as formulated in a temporal sense, as in, if at some time nothing had existed, for such a state would have to temporally precede the universe. Rather, one should strip all such talk of all temporal notions so that we get the proposition, if nothing existed, then nothing could exist, which could be expressed in two different ways using modal terms. 1. Necessarily, if nothing existed, then nothing would exist. And 2. If nothing existed, then necessarily nothing would exist. The first reading is, as Morrison states, just tautological. If nothing exists, then nothing exists. The second reading, however, asserts that, in the case that nothing would exist, that would be the case since it would be necessarily true. Morrison laments that, giving this reading, nothingness cannot be understood as a condition that makes the antecedent true. The fact that necessarily nothing would exist cannot follow from the fact that nothing exists. It's the other way around. If nothing existed, that's because necessarily there is nothing that could exist. But that wouldn't answer the question as to why it is necessary that nothing could exist, and therefore the proposition seems irrelevant to the argument. Morrison thinks that Craig must mean something like this. If at a given time there were nothing at all apart from time, then at no later time could anything begin to exist. But then, as Morrison points out, if there is no quote-unquote time at which nothing existed, but only a first state of the universe, then this doesn't help us either. Since Craig maintains that something begins to exist even if it exists at a time t and there is no time prior to t, this principle cannot advance his case. The critic need not maintain that the universe literally emerged from a state of nothingness, he simply needs to hold that there is a first instant of the universe. I actually agree with Morrison here. The intuition, from nothing nothing comes, doesn't really advance the argument and doesn't justify premise 1. It sounds like mere sloganeering. Morrison then turns to the question of metaphysical intuitions. He differentiates between two different meanings of coming into being. There is intratemporal coming into being within time, and there is extratemporal coming into being without a cause as the first instant. He notes that these propositions cannot be known a priori, and that our intuitions may support the first but not necessarily the second proposition. Morrison believes it to be rational to accept intratemporal coming into being on the grounds of broad metaphysical intuitions, but not extratemporal coming into being. So he turns to the question of empirical judgment. Morrison argues that an empirical justification of the first premise is difficult, for while there may be some general justification for it by observation, there are observations that run counter to the argument. A. All things do have material causes, and B. Causes precede their effects. Given these facts, empirical justification may apply to IT, but not ET. Morrison then turns to the question of the personal nature of a supposed cause of the universe. He reconstructs Craig's supposed case for the personal nature of said cause as following. A. It has been shown that the universe has not always existed. B. The cause of the universe must be eternal. C. The cause of the universe must be either a personal agent or a non-personal sufficient condition. D. If a causal condition sufficient for the production of the universe exists from eternity, then the universe has always existed. E. So the cause of the universe is not a non-personal sufficient condition. F. The cause of the universe must therefore be a person. Morrison points out that God's eternal will to create the universe manifests an eternal causal condition sufficient for the production of the universe as well. He writes, if God can have willed from eternity that there be a world with a beginning in time, why couldn't a non-personal cause have been sufficient from eternity for the existence of a world with a beginning in time? I think Morrison is right here when he states that Craig's argument moves back and forth between two opposed conceptions of eternity. Eternity as timelessness and eternity as beginninglessness and endless temporal duration. Craig argues that if an impersonal cause is eternal, then its effect should be eternal too. So the universe would have to be eternal, i.e. of infinite past duration. But what if the cause is eternal in the sense of just being timeless and not being past eternal? Morrison concludes, it is at this point that Craig's argument breaks down. Since there is no time in this sense of eternity, the argument cannot get a grip on it. I think Morrison showed successfully that in order for his argument to work, Craig needs to equivocate on two distinct meanings of eternality, or, as I believe, that there is something missing that needs to be added. The second paper I want to address is Graeme Arby's on uncaused beginnings. What I like about it is that Arby addresses the questions that have to be posed to somebody who denies the causal premise. Arby frames the issue like this. 1. If it is possible for reality to have a contingent initial state under the causal relation, i.e., it is possible for reality to have a contingent initial state that has no cause, then it is possible for other parts of reality to have no cause. 2. It is not possible for other parts of reality to have no cause. 3. Therefore, it is not possible for reality to have a contingent initial state that has no cause. To avoid the force of this argument, Arby maintains the following. The properties of being initial and non-initial states of reality are essential properties of states of reality. He thinks that whatever kind of state can in principle be a temporally first world state would be fundamentally different from any causally succeeding state. And therefore, all states that do exist as causal successors, such as any ordinary world state we experience, cannot be thought of as possible initial states. Arby writes, if it were really possible that a rabbit might have popped uncaused out of the void, then it would have to be possible for there to be nothing other than a rabbit in existence. But I think it is manifestly impossible for the initial state of reality to be exhausted by the state of a single rabbit. Rabbits are not the kinds of things that are capable of this kind of lonely existence. On the contrary, rabbits can only exist as a part of a larger network of related entities. The initial state of reality has to be the kind of thing that can exist even though there is nothing else in existence, and the things that feature in the initial state of reality have to be the kind of things that can exist as parts of an initial state of reality. Arby's idea can be formulated as such. Objects or states that include objects that have causes do necessarily have causes. Ordinary objects or states including ordinary objects have causes. Therefore, ordinary objects or states including ordinary objects do necessarily have causes, and therefore ordinary objects or states including ordinary objects cannot begin to exist uncaused. So if the question is, why doesn't a rabbit just pop into existence somewhere right now, Arby would reply that rabbits are not the kind of objects that can begin to exist uncaused, even though other different kind of objects can. And we do know this because we know that rabbits do have causes. Now, Arby proposes this as a hypothesis that may account for the data, but he also makes a further step analyzing possible uncaused beginnings. Suppose that there is a table in a room in which you are hearing this talk. Is it possible that a tiger come into existence uncaused out of nothing where that table is? I don't think so. I assume that it is just impossible for the table and the tiger to simultaneously occupy the same spatial location. If there is to be a tiger where the table now is, then it cannot be that the table also continues to be there. In order for a tiger to occupy some tiger-shaped space, that space must have appropriate internal and boundary properties. There are, after all, lots of ways that the boundary and interior of that space could be that are simply inconsistent with the occupation of that space by a tiger. Arby believes that two or more distinct objects cannot occupy the same location at once, so that at any point in space that's occupied by some object, no object can just begin to exist. There are numerous things to be said about Arby's response, and I will make a video on it. I believe Arby's case is too strong. It would force him to conclude that there cannot be a first state of the universe, yet for now it suffices to state that Arby did what only a few have done, to properly address the issues that arise if one asserts that some things can begin to exist without a cause. The third paper I want to highlight is Eric Wielenberg's recent paper called Crack's Contradictory Kalam, Trouble at the Moment of Creation. In this paper, Wielenberg picks up where Morrison left off, discussing the question of how the beginning of the universe can be a temporal effect of a timeless personal cause. Wielenberg states, "When the universe exists, God is temporal rather than timeless. Since time begins with the creation of the universe, if there is some event that occurs at a given time, then the universe exists at that time, and hence God is temporal at that time." The problem is that Craig thinks of God being timeless without and in time with creation. But since the first instant of creation is simultaneous with God's act of causing it, it seems contradictory to assert that God is atemporal without and temporal with the universe, for these states would seemingly overlap, so that God would just be both temporal and atemporal. Wielenberg writes, "God must be temporal at T1 because the universe exists at T1. Yet, he must be timeless at T1 in order to have at T1 the power to create the universe. If one were to deny God's timelessness at the moment of creation, then the cause of the universe wouldn't be timeless either, and the argument would just collapse." Wielenberg asks, does God agent cause time beginning to exist in his timeless phase or his temporal phase? He cannot be in his timeless phase since the causal act occurs at T1, and as we've seen, on Craig's view, God must be temporal at T1. But God cannot be temporal either, since in that case the cause of time beginning to exist lies within time itself, and again, Craig and Sinclair insist that the cause of the beginning of time must be timeless. So if T1 is the beginning of time itself, then a God who is already temporal at T1 cannot cause said beginning. But if God changes from non-temporal to temporal prior to creation, then creation at T1 does not mark the beginning of time. But then, what constitutes a change from being non-temporal to being temporal? What is it that God actually does in order to become temporal? I believe Wielenberg is correct in showing that the way the question about God's temporal status is treated opens it up to the charge of being incoherent. The problem seems to me to originate from a confusion about what it means to be timeless and more fundamentally, what time is. I believe the nature of a timeless state, or that of a timeless entity, has to be defined modally and understood differently from the way these concepts usually are. So I believe Wielenberg's critique latches onto a real conceptual confusion that compels us to further think about the nature of time.